Hello and welcome. In this video, I wanted to take a look at two very interesting Necron lists, and I'll say this is going to be a bit of a different video as it's going to be a little bit more rapid fire than normal list videos. The reason for this is that I think these two lists are a bit of an evolution on previous Necron lists that I've covered, so it kind of extends from those, and it's not so much a look at something necessarily new, but rather how something changes over time. As such, if you're interested, check out the two videos I did previously. I'll link them in the description of this video below, and that way you can kind of see the progression and series of these different lists and how the Necron forces evolve. With that being said, let's get into the first list that we're going to be looking at today. This first list finished second place out of 56 players, and was played by a player named Matthew Jarvis in a tournament known as Kirtonian Total Carnage number 2. This tournament was held on October 15th in 2002 in England. And this list makes heavy utilization of the popular custom dynasty of the Eternal Conquerors and Relentless Expansionists. This custom dynasty gives all of your Necron units objectives secured, as well as a 6-inch pre-game move, which can be very powerful in order to help you position and hold objectives. Now with that being said, unlike most lists that begin with a battalion detachment, this one chooses to begin with an Outrider detachment. This Outrider detachment includes one HQ choice, being a Chronomancer armed with an Aeon Stave. The Chronomancer is a powerful HQ choice that can help bolster your units and keep them alive and healthy on the battlefield. In addition to that, he is a Cryptech, and as such, he has chosen to bring some bound creations known as Crypto Thralls, and as such this list includes a no-force organization slot of 2 Crypto Thralls. The Crypto Thralls have mostly fallen out of favor as they become a little bit weaker within the Nephilim chapter approved 9th edition rules. However, they're still very viable, although the Scarab Swarms have once again overtaken them a bit in the list creation, though as we can see here, they're still very viable, though they're in a bit of a different role than they once were before. In either case, this detachment continues on and skips over the troop choice entirely, as it is an Outrider detachment and does not need to include a troop choice. And as such, we come to the fast attack choice for this Outrider detachment. The first fast attack choice is a unit of 9 Scarab Swarms, the second a unit of 6 Scarab Swarms, and the third being a unit of 3 Scarab Swarms. The Scarab Swarms are generally a powerful unit for grabbing objectives as well as being a general nuisance to your opponent. They definitely have been seeing a little less play, especially in those larger units like the first one that we see here. However, they do still see plenty of play within units of 3 to 5 Scarab Swarms, though as you can see this list has opted to go for a bit of a higher inclusion of them, as they can actually perform somewhat well in those larger units against certain enemy units, and they're definitely never a bad choice to have within a Necron list. However, this detachment includes one more fast attack choice. That fast attack choice being a unit of 3 Tomb Blades. This unit of Tomb Blades is armed with particle beamers and no additional upgrades. This is kind of interesting to see, as normally at least one Tomb Blade is given a Shadow Loom for the cost of 3 points, as they'll give the model a 5+ invulnerable save, and it's kind of normal to see that in most situations. Sometimes they'll even include shield veins to get a slightly better save on a couple models within the unit so that they could better distribute different wounds coming into the unit. However, that being said, this list does come out to a total of 2,000 points exactly, so there probably wasn't any room for those different upgrades when the list was created. However, I will say, if it was up to me, I would have probably dropped one of the Scarab bases in one of those larger units in order to get the points just to get this upgrade and maybe a couple other things here and there. Though with that in mind, do keep in mind that I'm not the end-all be-all of list building, and it definitely comes down to preference of choice, and this list has actual practical results, whereas mine is just theoretical. And with that, we conclude the fast attack choices for the Outrider detachment. We move on to the last unit type choice within this detachment, that being a flyer choice consisting of 2 different flying units, both those units being the very popular Doom Scythe that we saw showing up the last time we looked within Necron lists. And at the time, it was kind of a new inclusion. However, as we'll see today, the Doom Scythe has become a rather standard inclusion within different Necron forces. The reason for this is most likely that we're seeing a lot more Titanic lists, and a lot more lists that include heavy armor targets, where those Doom Scythes can do a lot of work, and not to mention that as we discussed previously, the Doom Scythes have seen a big enough points decrease that they've once again become kind of an interesting unit. So with the utility increase of both the Tomb Blades and the power increase of the Doom Scythe, I will say the combat patrol for the Necrons has definitely gained a lot of power. In addition to that, the Immortals have definitely been seeing a lot of play, though as we'll see within this list and the following list, they have fallen a little bit out of favor, so you do have to consider that while the Doom Scythe and the Tomb Blades have gone up in power, the Immortals and the Overlord have gone down in power slightly. Though that being said, I think there's still a perfectly fine choice, and I do think that the Necron Combat Patrol has definitely gone up in power significantly, and it's definitely something that as a new player, you can pretty much buy and be incredibly happy with, as it includes 500 or more points, depending on how you build it and how you want to play it, giving you quite a lot of options, and a lot of good choices for a Necron army. And with that being said, we come to the second detachment of the first army list. The second detachment within this army list is a Vanguard detachment, once again opting to go with a more command point intensive detachment choice, as opposed to a patrol or a battalion detachment, to include some of the more specific units that this list wanted instead of having a more genericized build. And this Vanguard detachment begins with an HQ choice, as detachments normally do. The HQ choice for this Vanguard detachment is a Technomancer armed with a Canoptic Cloak. The Technomancer is pretty much the second most popular Cryptech HQ choice after the Chronomancer, as he can help resurrect different core units, as well as have a solid amount of mobility and utility on the battlefield. As such, he's very common and pretty much rivals the Chronomancer. However, the other two Cryptics have pretty much fallen out of the meta, which is a little sad to see as they have rather cool models. Anyway, with that being said, we come to the lead choice of this Vanguard detachment, which is the primary choice, once again skipping those troop choices in favor of bringing more specialized units. The lead choice begins with a Catan Shard of the Void Dragon. This Catan Shard has become more and more popular over time, similar to those Doom sites, especially now that we're seeing those Titanic vehicle units and more lists bringing more vehicles in general. The Catan Shard of the Void Dragon has also seen a rather drastic points decrease, going from 350 points to a flat 300 points. It's also one of my favorite models within the line, so it's good to see that it's kind of caught up with the other Catan choices that were out previously. It's also good to mention that all of the different Catan shards, including the Tesseract Vault at this point, have seen play within competitive Necron lists, so you do have a plethora of choice as a Necron player in terms of what power units you wish to bring within a list. And as far as special Catan powers go, the Void Dragon has been given the Sky of Falling Stars, which is a rather common one to see and gives him some anti-swarm capabilities, as well as some ability to do some work against units with 5 or more models. Because this Catan power allows him to select 3 enemy units that are within range of this Catan power, and then roll a d6 for each of those units, and if the roll is between 1 and 5, and less than the number of models within that unit, the unit suffers d3 mortal wounds. And generally you're going to get quite a few mortal wounds out of this, and it's going to do a decent amount of work. The other perks of the Void Dragon is that the Void Dragon is generally an anti-vehicle unit, though he can still be very powerful against other targets as well, so he's no slouch within combat, and the reduced points cost has definitely made him a much more common inclusion within different Necron armies, and as such he seems to be one of the more popular Catan shards that we're seeing within different builds. Anyway, moving on to the second elite choice of this army, it's one that we haven't seen for a little while, that being a Canoptic Spider. The Canoptic Spider started out its lifespan within Necron forces, being rather prominent within different lists. However, as time went on, the Canoptic Spider kind of fell out of favor, and that's a little sad to see, as not only is it a rather interesting model, but it also has some anti-sucker capabilities in the inclusion of a Gloom Prism, which costs an additional 5 points, and this spider does have that upgrade. In general, I think the Canoptic Spider is still a perfectly fine unit, but the reason it has fallen a little bit out of favor is mostly because the Necrons had become a more aggressive force, and for a while they were just maximizing on the number of aggressive units they could bring, so the Canoptic Spider being more of a resilience unit was not as popular. Though that being said, it seems like the Necron lists are becoming a little more universal now, as opposed to focusing on pure aggression or pure swarms like they previously did, so the Spider might be making a bit of a comeback, as I've been seeing a little more of them included within different lists. I really do like the design of the Gloom Prism as well, as it gives an army such as Necrons some ability to interact with psychic powers without being too overwhelming, as it simply just allows them to try to deny psychic powers, but because the Gloom Prism is on a specific unit, they still have to keep in mind how they position and what enemy psychic powers they wish to deny, giving it a lot of different skill and gameplay aspects. And with that being said, we can move on to the final 2 elite choices for this Vanguard detachment, and the final 2 elite choices are also the final 2 choices within this Vanguard detachment. Those 2 choices being 2 units of 6 Scorpic Destroyers each. The Scorpic Destroyers are one of those aggressive units that can just do a ton of work within any Necron army, and I do think they're one of the more powerful units that the Necrons have access to. Though that being said, the Necrons do have a ton of different powerful units that can fill a very similar role, and it just kind of comes down to if you want the pure aggression of the Scorpic Destroyers, the higher mobility of the Ophidian Destroyers, or the heavier durability of something like the Canoptic Wraiths. In any case, you do have a lot of choices, and you do have a lot of different ways of building an Necron army. However, I do like the inclusion of the Scorpic Destroyers as they give you that very heavy melee threat that can really threaten any opponent and make them play rather guarded wherever the Scorpic Destroyers are headed. So it's a very good way of bullying certain opponents in certain situations as they can be a very big threat. Though that being said, because of the popularity and the inclusion of more monstrous units within different army lists, the Scorpic Destroyers have become a little weaker. However, they can still do a decent amount of damage thanks to the special weapon every third Scorpic Destroyer has equipped. Though generally that's why you're going to see less Scorpic Destroyers and more inclusion of things like the Doomscythe and Necron lists. And finally, this list concludes with one final detachment, that being a Supreme Command detachment. This Supreme Command detachment includes the Silent King, which pretty much is ubiquitous in most Necron lists. The Silent King is just a very powerful unit that you pretty much want in any list that you're building at a 2000 point scale. It is very hard to not include the Silent King within most Necron lists. However, there are situations where it does happen, but generally you're going to have a very good reason for why you wouldn't include him as opposed to why you would. He's just such a powerful unit, and he's one that can just do so much work, especially against stronger and more armored units, so it's once again just one of those things that kind of skews you to wanting to include him within an army list instead of not. And the Silent King has been given one upgrade, as he is the warlord of this army list. He has been given the warlord trait of the Triarch's Will. The Triarch's Will is an interesting one, as it allows you to select 4 command protocols and assign one of those command protocols to 2 different battle rounds, and as such you have much more control over those command protocols. Not to mention that the command protocols have definitely gotten stronger within the Necron forces, giving this warlord trait a lot more ability to be successful within a game. Now, one thing you might have noticed is that there's something interesting going on with this list. This list includes an Outrider and a Vanguard detachment, meaning that it has spent 6 command points total, and the inclusion of the Supreme Command detachment is 0 points. However, the Supreme Command detachment only refunds command points in the situation that you take a patrol, battalion, or brigade detachment. It does not refund points for a Vanguard or Outrider detachment. However, do keep in mind, the Silent King has a special ability known as the Silent King. And that special ability reads, if your army is battle forged, then Xeric must be your army's warlord, and in addition to that, you'll receive 3 additional command points if Xeric is your warlord. This means that this army list actually starts out with 2 command points total because it took the warlord trait on Xeric himself. This is a little bit of an interesting corner case, as when I first saw it, I thought, wait a minute, how are they getting those additional command points? Because in a lot of cases, if you're not a Necron player, you just assume that most lists are getting the refund from the command points for taking a patrol or battalion detachment in addition to Supreme Command. However, in reality, the Silent King goes one step further and actually generates 2 command points that are becoming more and more of a premium, so Necrons actually are a lot more resilient to some of the command point changes that we saw within the Nephilim chapter approved changes. It's actually a very interesting ability, and I wish more characters and armies had access to something like this, and maybe you can only have one instance of it, but it would be nice to have more ways of kind of gaining more command points in order to spend them on different things within your army list, as opposed to kind of always being restricted to 6 command points, which can be rather rough for a lot of different armies. With the first list being covered, let's dive into the second list right away and then do the overview at the end of the video instead of doing it after each individual list, as both lists do have certain things in common that I would like to touch upon after we complete looking at both of them. The second list that we're going to look at placed second place out of 100 players, played by a player known as Idavalo Heimdall. Hopefully I got the name right, and my apologies if I mess it up in any way. This list was played in the Kippers Melee 2022 10th anniversary on October 15th in Canada. This list once again utilized the custom dynasty of the Relentlessly Expansionist and Eternal Conquerors build, and that's going to be pretty standard as that is generally the most popular option within the Necron forces. At the very least, you're oftentimes going to see Eternal Conquerors, but you might see a variance in the second option that they go with for the custom dynasty. You'll also see a couple normal dynasties as well, but those are more exceptions than the rule itself. Anyway, this list begins with a Supreme Command detachment being composed of the Silent King with the warlord trait of the Triarch's Will, and I'm not going to go into too much depth about him as we just covered him within the previous list. So let's keep looking at the rest of this list. This list continues on to have a Spearhead detachment. Once again, notice that this is not a patrol or battalion or brigade detachment, showing that the Necrons are making more and more utilization out of different special unit types as opposed to going for the more standard builds, which include different troop choices. There are still many lists that do utilize different troop choices within them. It just seems like there's also a faction of players who have chosen to forgo troops altogether. Anyway, the Spearhead detachment begins with its HQ choices as detachments normally do. The first of those HQ choices is a rather powerful character that has gotten all the stronger within the 9th edition rules as time has gone on. This character is Illuminar Xeris, and he's an incredibly powerful Technomancer that brings pretty much everything two Technomancers would bring to the table, in addition to being able to buff different Necron units incredibly well as the game progresses. He's definitely one of those units that can snowball very successfully as he continues to increase the power of your different Necron forces. There aren't a ton of units that can take advantage of all of his different buffs, but many units can benefit from at least some of his different buffs, though they are randomly generated, so it's not as straightforward as grabbing him and getting everything you want, though for the points cost that he comes in at, it's actually really easy to include him and still be very happy as the game progresses. This Illuminar Xeris has also been given a Warlord trait, and he must take the Enduring Will. The Enduring Will is a rather good one to have, as it reduces damage by 1 to a minimum of 1. Damage reduction abilities are always powerful, and they're all the better on a character like this, who can definitely be targeted down, though has some native durability, and it's one of those Warlord traits that you do see on different units, and I think it's one that should be utilized when you have the opportunity to do so with a rather durable unit, whether that's an Illuminar Xeris or a Catacomb Command Barge. Though that being said, it's also not a necessary trait either, so you can definitely have some flexibility on whether you want to take it or not. Moving on in the HQ choices, there is a second HQ choice within the Spearhead detachment, that being a standard Necron Lord. Normally it's kind of uncommon to see a Necron Lord, as normally people spring for the Overlord or one of the other HQ choices. However, the Necron Lord is one of the cheapest HQ choices you can have within the Necron forces, and he does do enough to be an interesting include within different Necron armies. This Lord has been given quite a few different upgrades as well, being armed with a Resurrection Orb, as well as a Relic and Warlord trait. The relic that this Lord has been given is the Voltaic Staff, and it's one that increases his output by increasing the power of a Staff of Light rather significantly. It's also one of the more popular relics, however it has fallen off a bit in popularity ever since the command point changes occurred within the Nephilim chapter approved. Though that being said, it does still see occasional use, and it's still a perfectly fine option if you just want a little more output on one of your character units that can carry a Staff of Light. In addition to that relic, the Necron Lord has been given a trait, which is the Impeccable Conqueror's trait. The Impeccable Conquerors gives the Necron Lord an aura that says Dynasty core units within 6 inches can reroll the charge roll when making charge attempts. This is once again a very powerful trait, and one that you're commonly going to see in different armies that wish to utilize melee characters, as a melee unit that does not make their charge roll automatically misses all of the attacks it would make, and is probably going to be wiped off the table before they even get a chance to charge once again. So anything that benefits making the charge roll for a melee unit is definitely going to be very desired and very powerful within the list. I'm actually surprised the previous list didn't include it, considering it includes 2 units of Scorpic Destroyers, though I'm guessing the player was confident that he would be making the majority of his charges and wouldn't necessarily need this trait on one of his different HQ choices in order to be successful in those situations. Definitely a little bit risky in my opinion, but if you want to start with a certain command points, you're going to have to make a few sacrifices along the way. Anyway, moving on from the HQ choice, we come to the Elite choice. This list employs 2 different Elite choices, the first one being a unit of 8 Lich Guard. And these Lich Guard have been armed with a sword and a shield. This is definitely the most popular way of equipping them, and makes them incredibly durable while also giving them a decent amount of output. They can also be armed with the scythes, but the scythes are a little bit too weak, and there are just better options within the Necron forces for aggressive melee units, such as the Scorpic Destroyers, that can perform the job a bit better than the Lich Guard in that situation. So it's interesting to see the return of the Lich Guard that fell out of favor a little bit, because once again the Necron forces were looking towards more aggression and less towards durability within the last few months. However, it does look like the Necron forces are making a bit of a return to those durable style lists, and that's why we're seeing more of these units like the Spider and the Lich Guard come back into play. And that's something we're going to touch upon once we finish looking at this list, because it's very important to keep in mind how the evolution of different Necron lists progress throughout 9th edition. Anyway, the second Elite choice is another one that isn't too common within lists anymore, but I do think it definitely has a home within the Necron forces. This second Elite choice is a Triarch Stalker, and the Triarch Stalker has actually seen a bit of a points reduction, going from 140 points to 125 points when armed with the Heat Ray. And in this case, the Triarch Stalker has been armed with that very specific weapon, which has 2 different firing profiles, giving it a lot of versatility within an army. The first of the Heat Ray profiles is a Flamer-like profile that has a 12-inch range, heavy 2d6 shots, and automatically hits when firing at a target. This profile comes in at 5 strength, 1 armor penetration, and 1 damage. Definitely a fine way of taking out swarm units. However, if you're looking for something a little more hard-hitting, the second profile is more of a multi-melta style build, which gives you 2 heavy shots at a 24-inch range, with a strength of 8 and 4 armor penetration, as well as a damage profile of d6 that goes up to d6 plus 2 when it is within half range, as meltas oftentimes do. and this gives you a lot of flexibility in terms of what kind of opponent you're targeting, as you can switch between those two different profiles each time you fire this weapon. And that gives you a lot of flexibility to fight against different types of lists, and as I mentioned previously, it's more common to see heavy firepower within different Necron forces to compensate against some of those heavy armor lists. Now that being said, the 24-inch range is a little bit difficult to get half range with, especially with such a big model as the Triarch Stalker. Though if you can manage it, it's definitely going to be a decent enough hit, though there are plenty of better options within the Necron forces for firepower such as this, so there's definitely some value placed on the Flamer style profile that lets you clean out swarms, and we'll see that in the future with this list as well. Moving on, we come to the fast attack choice of this army list. The fast attack choice consists of two different units, both units being a unit of 3 Tomb Blades, armed with particle beamers, and each of those Tomb Blades having Shadow Loom. And that is kind of interesting because this list includes neither Crypto Thralls nor Scarab Swarms, but rather chooses to go heavy on the Tomb Blades as they're a very fast moving unit that can position rather well and has a decent amount of durability once they're given a Shadow Loom, as it gives them that invulnerable save in addition to their normal save. You can even make them a little more durable with a Shield Vein, but that's definitely once again a matter of preference, and it does push their points cost up rather heavily once you start including all of those different options. In any case, it's kind of nice to see that the Necrons have a lot of choices for units that can take different objective positions, as the Tomb Blades are a durable enough unit with a bit of decent light firepower, while something like the Scarab Swarms are a much more low profile unit that can be rather annoying for an opponent to take out within melee, and the Crypto Thralls are a bit more of a brawler unit. And you even have some situations where you can take something like Death Marks to take an objective and then provide medium firepower at a rather solid range. So you have a lot of different options to play around with within the Necron forces for your kind of objective holding unit. Anyway, let's move on to the premier unit of the Spearhead Detachment, that being the heavy support choice. This list includes 4 different heavy support choices, the first 2 of which are Doomsday Arcs, and the Doomsday Arc has seen plenty of play throughout the 9th edition rules. However, it's one of those units that kind of shows up and then goes away for a while, as it has a rather heavy hitting main weapon, but it can be a little inconsistent. However, it also has a decent amount of firepower in the Gauss Flare arrays that it comes equipped with, meaning that it can actually replace your general blocks of Necron warriors if you're willing to trade off the troops and the different bodies of the Necron warriors for the Doomsday Arc and its heavier main weapon. The Doomsday Arc has also seen plenty of points decreases within the 9th edition, thus making it one very desirable unit that can be very durable and very annoying for an opponent to deal with, while also putting out a decent amount of firepower in both a light and heavy format. As for the 3rd and 4th heavy support choices for this Spearhead Detachment, they are both 2 units that are kind of unique from what we've normally seen, and that is 2 units of regular Locust Destroyers, being 2 regular Locust Destroyers and 1 heavy destroyer armed with a Gauss Destructor. This is a mix that you're allowed to make, as you're allowed to have 1 heavy Locust Destroyer for every 3 models within a unit of regular Locust Destroyers. However, normally we see the regular Locust Destroyers by themselves, or we see the Locust Heavy Destroyers by themselves, and it's very rare that we see a mix of the 2 such as this. Though it's definitely something you can do, and definitely that's something that's been done in the past, but very rarely, as usually you want one or the other, or you can just split up the 2 different units and have a unit of each, but I guess the player in this situation figured that it would be better to have some protection for his 2 heavy destroyers instead of having a unit of 2 heavy destroyers and a unit of 4 regular destroyers. I'm not 100% sure how much I understand the logic behind this, but I can understand it to some extent, as it does give that heavy destroyer some additional protection by utilizing the bodies of the regular destroyers. Neither the regular nor heavy destroyers are bad, and both have their position in the game. It's just that they kind of provide 2 different styles of firepower, with the regular destroyers being more of a mid-range unit, and the heavy destroyer being a heavy-hitting anti-armor unit, so kind of mixing their profiles gets a little weird at times. However, it's not the end of the world, and you just have to be aware of how you're positioning them and how you're targeting different units. In either case, it's a perfectly acceptable way to play the units, and it does show that this list is going for some heavy firepower, but it's also compensating some of its lightweight and medium range firepower by those regular Locust Destroyers and the Gauss Flare arrays on the Doomsday Arcs. However, this attachment does not conclude with the heavy support choice, but includes 2 flyers as well, once again being those 2 Doom Scythes. This shows that the Doom Scythe is kind of becoming prevalent throughout the different Necron forces, and I do think it's a unit that we're going to continue seeing play, as the points cost are low enough, and the main weapon of the Doom Scythe is rather strong and can target most units due to the unit being a flyer and having plenty of mobility, as well as visibility on different enemy units. It's also one of those things that, as long as armored targets are popular within the meta, you're definitely going to see skews towards these kind of lists, which have this kind of heavy firepower. As for what I think about these lists, I do think they say something very important about the Necron forces, and that is that think about how the Necrons evolved throughout the 9th edition. They start out as kind of troop spam lists, and as their different special options went down in price, as they were kind of overpriced in the beginning, you saw more and more variety within their different lists. And it's also interesting to point out that whereas Necrons were a very aggressive style of play, pretty much maximizing on the different destroyers and race that they could bring to a table, they've definitely become more of a durability army once again, as the meta has shifted once again to kind of armored targets, which some of those destroyer units might have some difficulty fighting against. Though this isn't a bad thing because it shows that the Necrons have so much depth in terms of how they can build their different lists, that they can pretty much build any style of list and be somewhat successful. It just sometimes depends on the meta and how different lists within the meta interact with the Necron forces. Though that being said, that's kind of the benefit of having such a vast variety of different units and having so much depth to a codex. Because if you're an army that has one army list build in itself, you might enjoy playing that list and you might have a good time with it, but if the meta shifts outside of that list being particularly viable, you can easily find yourself in a situation where you're going to be struggling no matter what you play against, simply because the meta has shifted in such a way that is unfavorable to that one list that your army can build. However, the downside is if you build one style of army and then the meta shifts, you still might be having trouble with it because it takes a lot of time to build up those different units and build up those different selection choices. However, if you stay with the hobby long enough, you will collect a lot of different models and you will have a lot of different options available to you. So that is something that definitely benefits players who stick with the game long term and aren't just hopping from army to army, but rather take the time to build up one army, especially if it's an army like the Necrons. And I think the Necrons are definitely in a very healthy place, and I do think they have a ton of variety, as we've seen with these lists and the two previous lists that I mentioned at the beginning of this video, and you can find a link in the description below if you wish to watch those two different videos, as they detail lists that are quite different from this, but the lists in those videos do have a lot of similarities that kind of show how the different lists evolved over time to get to the point that we're at now. However, we're also probably seeing a lot of diversity in the different units that are being brought within Necron armies as well. Anyway, let me know in the comments down below which of these two lists you like the most, and if there's a specific type of Necron army that you enjoy playing. It's a little unfortunate that we haven't seen a Silver Tide list in a while for the Necron forces, but if I do end up seeing one, I will try to cover it sooner than later. Anyway, have a happy October, and I think it's very fitting that we're covering the spooky scary skeleton boys within the month of October.